Hey everybody, welcome to Crazy Tech Lab, and today it's the big one because I am going to be reviewing AMD's brand new Ryzen 7000 Zen 4 5nm processors. We've got this 7900X with us here today, the brand new flagship Ryzen 9 16-core CPU, which is the successor to the fabulous Ryzen 9 5950X. And we also have the Ryzen 7 7700X, which is of course their 8-core 16-thread CPU, which is the successor to the Ryzen 7 5800X. So today, got some super interesting details to go through, full benchmark suite, and we are going to be comparing these bad boys against their predecessors, which I've just mentioned, as well as a whole bunch of other AMD CPUs, and also, of course, Intel's Core i9 12900K and Core i7 12700K, because those are the CPUs that these two are kind of going up against. The 12700K obviously undercutting at the moment the Ryzen 7 7700X by a little bit. Here in the UK, at least from launch pricing that we're looking at, it is going to retail a little bit cheaper than the new AMD CPU. The Ryzen 9 7950X still getting confirmed pricing in for that, but it is looking like it is going to be a fair bit more than the 12900K. Hopefully a lot more performance as well. We will have to wait and see on that one. I would like to thank AMD for sending over these samples, and also to ASRock, who has kitted me out with a whole bunch of motherboards, including the awesome X670E Tai Chi, which is what we've got here. And I can say that from the outset, socket AM5 is looking very stable, which is great news, because if any journalist out there, if you ask any journalist out there about the original Ryzen launch, they will tell you that it was a bit of a dog's dinner in terms of stability and memory compatibility and all that malarkey. Very stable here with X670E. I don't think I had any problems whatsoever in terms of stability. AMD's Expo, its XMP equivalent, working absolutely flawlessly with the ASRock Trident Z Neo Expo kit, I believe, that there was in the sample pack. So that was, yeah, worked without a hitch. So that's kind of a bit surprising, really, for a new socket. We've had plenty of issues from both blue and Handbrake corners over the years when it comes to new sockets and stability issues, but this time, thankfully, at least with my gear that I'm using, everything seems to be stable. Yeah, don't tell anybody. So great news from that point of view. And again, thanks to ASRock. So what we'll be doing today is running through a whole load of benchmarks, including games, obviously, and content creation as well. And we'll also be throwing in the Ryzen 7 5800X3D, which is the 3D Vcache model. Obviously, stunning gaming performance, but not great in some content creation workloads. So we'll be seeing if these CPUs have managed to beat that in games, and also whether or not they can beat it in content creation as well. I think that's pretty much a given, but how much do they beat it? Is it still worth going for that CPU when you've got brand new 5nm silicon sitting on the desk here, and maybe on your desk soon, who knows? So that's pretty much it from the intro point of view. All I will ask you to do is to subscribe and like and comment on this video. Subscription particularly useful at the moment, because I have a whole bunch of videos coming out today and over the next few days for this launch. So socket AM5, I will be delving into all these motherboards over the next few days as well, and I will also be doing some key videos about instruction, how to use socket AM5, specifically how to install a processor, because if you're coming from an existing AMD system, the whole kind of pin grid array with, well, basically a whole, if you flip the latch, you've got a load of pins in there, is the simplest way to describe it. That's very different to what you've dealt with before. So there are ways to install your CPU, and there are ways not to install your CPU, and the ways not to install your CPU can quite easily brick your motherboard, damaged beyond repair, and that is not something I want to see happen to anybody. I've been there, I've done it, thankfully not with any socket AM4 and AM5 motherboards yet. But it does happen. You just need to tweak one of those pins and it's game over. So I'm going to be showing you in a video that's hopefully launching today that is going to run you through the whole process of installing that processor with basically in the most foolproof way you possibly can. So subscribe to this channel, don't miss out on those future videos, and let's crack on with the show. The first graph then is Cinebench R23, and this is the multi-threaded test. And here, as you can see, the AMD Ryzen 9 7950X absolutely destroyed everything here. It's over 10,000 points ahead of the Core i9 12900K and a huge amount faster than the Ryzen 9 5950X. So what we're looking at here is basically an AMD CPU with the untapped 170 watt power supply and just absolutely annihilating everything because of that. So if you need something that's fast in multi-threaded applications, this is by far and away the new king of the hill, at least in Cinebench. And yeah, just absolutely destroying everything here in the graphs. There's just no coming back for any other CPU. Okay, so next up is the Ryzen 7 7700X in the same benchmark, Cinebench R23 multi-threaded, and it's a pretty good score. It's nearly as fast as the Ryzen 9 5900X. Still a little way off the 12700K, which at the moment is cheaper in a lot of places, but look at how much faster it is than the Ryzen 7 5800X. It's adding pretty much 33% onto that score, so adding nearly a third extra performance onto that score, which is absolutely amazing. So definitely a big step up for AMD's 8-core CPU here, and obviously a lot faster than the Ryzen 7 5800 X3D as well, which generally suffers in these kinds of workloads. Now this is the really interesting one, and I wanted to try and keep these results separate because it gets very messy, as you can see. But basically here we've got the Ryzen 9 7950X at full 170 watt TDP, then we drop it down to 105 watts and then to 65 watts using eco mode. And the really insane thing here is that, as you can see, even at 65 watts, this CPU is beating every other CPU in the graph. So it's faster than the Core i9 12900K, it's faster than its predecessor, the Ryzen 9 5950X. Just an absolutely insane result there. And for a 65 watt CPU, I mean, you can probably cool it with a 20 buck cooler. You know, just £20, $20, just a very, very small, modest, humble CPU cooler you'd be able to cool this thing with and still get that performance, which is just incredible. Opening up the taps to 105 watts does net you a bit more performance, but you have to go all the way up to 170 to see the insane score of 38,422 at the top there. But just all eyes on that 65 watt result. I can't wait to see what kind of mini ITX systems, small form factor systems you can build with this, because the power that you can now get for just 65 watts is absolutely incredible. So well done AMD on that part. And eco mode, as I mentioned earlier, will land soon with a one-click option both in Ryzen Master and your motherboard's EFI. Okay, so Cinebench R23 single-threaded benchmark this time then, and to start with, we're just going to focus on the 7950X, which of course lands the top spot. As you would expect, AMD done great things with frequency and IPC with the new Zen 4 core, or core architecture, should I say, and 2,050 points. And basically the only one that gets close is the Ryzen 7 7700X. I think the 12900KS model was also pretty fast in this test, but that's not that readily available and is also pretty expensive for what it is. Still an awesome CPU though. And the Core i9 12900K 1992, so that's quite some way off that 7950X mark. So AMD definitely taking the performance crown in this single-threaded test. Going with the Ryzen 7 7700X this time, the 8-core 16-thread CPU, and as we've already mentioned, it does pretty well, comes second, and even beats the Core i9 12900K, so some seriously powerful single-threaded performance with that CPU as well, and comfortably beats the Core i7 12700K, which could only muster 1930, so around 77 points adrift there. And just look at the difference between the Ryzen 7 7700X and the Ryzen 7 5800X. That's a huge leap in single-threaded performance, so well done AMD. So moving on to Handbrake now then, and we've got a massive score once again for the Ryzen 9 7950X. nearly 40% faster than the Core i9 12900K here, and just absolutely huge amount faster. So if you're into video encoding and all that kind of malarkey, then this is one CPU that will save you a heck of a lot of time, and it's also significantly faster than the Ryzen 9 5950X, and that's to be expected because the Ryzen 9 5950X was, of course, an absolute beast once overclocked, but of course it had the power limits set pretty conservatively to keep within that 105 watt envelope at stock speed, but obviously upping that to 170 watts is what you've got with the 7950X. So an absolutely great score from AMD here. Now switching to the Ryzen 7 7700X in bold in the graph so you can see it a little easier, and pretty much even with the Core i7 12700K here. So that's actually quite impressive given the core and thread deficit of the Ryzen 7 7700X. Obviously the Core i7 12700K being a little bit cheaper though, so kind of swings and roundabouts here. It's great from an efficiency point of view in terms of cores and threads, but not so great on the price front. Next up then is the combined Photoshop and Lightroom workflow in the Procyon combined benchmark, and this has the Ryzen 9 7950X way out in the front compared to both the Core i9 12900K and the Ryzen 9 5950X. So a great score from AMD here. And pretty close behind it though is the Ryzen 7 7700X. So if you want a bit of an upgrade for your Lightroom and Photoshop work, then the Ryzen 7 7700X doesn't do badly at all, but for the absolute best performance you want the Ryzen 9 7950X, which is also a lot faster than Intel's equivalent and also than its predecessor. Focusing on the Ryzen 7 7700X now then, and its score of 12,203 points puts it well ahead of every other CPU other than the new Ryzen 9, significantly ahead of the Ryzen 7 5800X, and impressively a lot faster than the Core i7 12700K as well. So it's a great result from AMD here, and this is basically the go-to CPU for Photoshop and Lightroom. If you're a heavy user of those programs, this CPU is excellent value. Moving on to Adobe Premiere Pro then, and this is the Puget Systems benchmark score, which is based on a real workflow through the software, and it's generally a little better indicator than just a simple export, which I have done in the past when the software was mostly CPU based before they introduced GPU acceleration, but this is a much better benchmark for what you'll actually see while you're using the software. And the Core i9 12900K does top the graph here, so Intel has usually been pretty strong in Premiere Pro, and it's no surprise to see that here. However, the Ryzen 9 7950X does give it a modest run for its money and is also faster than the Core i7 12700K, but the 12700K pretty much the one to buy here given its price, and it also beats the Ryzen 7 7700X. So moving on to the Ryzen 7 7700X comparison, and as we can see, we just mentioned it's a fair bit slower than the Core i7 12700K in this test, but was noticeably faster still than the Ryzen 7 5800X, and also in fact than pretty much every other CPU in the graph, going right from the two old Ryzen 9s and obviously the Ryzen 7 5800X3D. So the Ryzen 7 7700X, not the ideal processor for Premiere Pro. Starting off with Watch Dogs with our game test then, and the AMD Ryzen 9 7950X was pretty much level pegging with the other ZEN 4 CPU, as well as the Core i7 12700K and the 12900K, so kind of level pegging with Intel there rather than beating it. The obviously all the ZEN 3 CPUs, the older AMD CPUs, not doing quite so well, with distinct drops in the minimum 99th percentile and average frame rates. If we move to the Ryzen 7 7700X though, we can see that it tops the graph and matches the Core i9 12900K with the best result on test. Slightly ahead than the Ryzen 9 7950X, but it's almost within the margin of error at the top there. But it does just about beat the Core i7 12700K, but obviously that CPU is a little bit cheaper. Forza Horizon 5 is our next game test then, and at 1080p, the AMD Ryzen 9 7950X was pretty much at the top of the graph, along with the usual suspects, the two Intel 12th gen CPUs, and of course the Ryzen 7 7700X, and also offered a noticeable advantage over the AMD Ryzen 9 5950X, which was at the bottom of the graph, but we're not talking about huge amounts here. Switching to the Ryzen 7 7700X focus graph then, and we can see that it is pretty much level pegging with the cheaper Core i7 12700K, as well as the Ryzen 9 and the Core i9 12900K, and noticeably quicker than most other CPUs in the graph, including the Ryzen 7 5800X3D, which was again only slightly faster than the other Zen 3 CPUs. Far Cry has been an interesting test because it tends to scale relatively well with new generations of CPUs, cores and frequencies, so it was interesting to see how the new CPUs fared here, and we weren't disappointed with the AMD Ryzen 9 7950X all but matching the stunning score offered by the Ryzen 7 5800X3D a few months ago, and also just about level pegging with the Core i7 12700K and 12900K, which did manage slightly higher average frame rates, but it was a pretty good result overall and a significant improvement over the rest of the Zen 3 product stack. Our final game test then just focuses in Far Cry 6 on the Ryzen 7 7700X, and here we can see highlighted in the graph that the 7700X was pretty much level pegging with the 12700K, but again that Intel CPU managing a slightly higher average frame rate, which was kind of mirrored with the 12900K as well. But compared to the 5800X, well, things were significantly faster here with the 5800X only managing a 99th percentile of 91 frames versus 100 frames for the 7700X, and the average frame rate even higher, going from 124 frames per second for the 5800X to 134 frames per second for the 7700X. Our last set of numbers now then, and it is power consumption, and this is under full load in Prime 95 with AVX instructions disabled, and we can see that the Ryzen 9 7950X is quite a monster under full load with that 170 watt TDP coming into play, outstripping even the Core i9 12900K by 70 watts. So it's not surprising that AMD is leaning quite heavily on eco mode and dropping that TDP to 105 or even 65 watts, where you drop a fair amount of performance, but you're still getting performance that outperforms the 12900K and 5950X in a lot of benchmarks. The 5950X though still doing pretty well, 217 watts under full load. Story for the Ryzen 7 7700X, which drew 273 watts, which again is around 30 watts more than the Core i7 12700K, which was a little faster in quite a few benchmarks and is also a fair bit cheaper as well. Compared to the 5800X, again, that's a marked step up, about 40 watts more than its predecessor, and even more under full load than the Ryzen 9 5900X as well. Okay, so coming onto the final page of graphs now then, and it is probably one of the most interesting, or certainly my favourite, because it's got eco mode, and I've just brought the Cinebench scores that we've seen earlier into this single page so we can actually see a little better what is going on and get some comparison numbers. So starting with the 7950X, a pretty big power draw under full load, it has to be said, 376 watts if you look at the bottom of the graph, bottom of the bottom graph, and at the top of the top graph though we can see why, because it's got an absolutely monstrous Cinebench score. So even though it's drawing 70 watts more than the 12900K, it's pretty much annihilating that CPU in Cinebench, over 10,000 points more, which is a huge gulf. And I think if you're using these CPUs every day to do this kind of workload, the extra 70 watts is going to be absolutely worth paying for, as will the extra budget. But if we drop the 7950X down to 100 watts, sure, you're losing about 7,000 points. You're scoring 31,000 instead of 38,000, but that is still way more than any other CPU. It's, what's that, about 3,000 or 4,000 points more still than the Core i9 12900K, and a lot more than the Ryzen 9 5950X. But if we look at the 105 watt version of the 7950X in the bottom graph, you've shaved over 100 watts off this system draw. So it's now undercutting both the Ryzen 7 7700X and the Core i9 12900K and the latter by over 30 watts. So that's pretty interesting. But what is even more interesting is the Ryzen 9 7950X at the 75 watt eco mode limit, because you're dropping just another 1,000 points or so on that Cinebench score. You're still gaining over 2,500 points over the Core i9 12900K, still annihilating the Ryzen 9 5950X. But look at where the power is. The top of the bottom graph, you can see the Ryzen 9 7950X, or near the top, should I say, joint with the 7700X, 203 watts for the system as a whole. That undercuts everything else. It undercuts the Core i9 12900K by over 100 watts, yet it beats it significantly, convincingly in Cinebench. And that's just an absolutely just crazy. My mind just can't compute that. How a CPU that's got a TDP of just 65 watts, and as the system as a whole is basically drawing the same as like a 6-core CPU, you're getting performance that is annihilating every other 16-core CPU in the graph. It's just absolutely crazy. So that's definitely worth considering. You're going to need a lot less cooling. You might even be able to get away with a low profile cooler. I know a lot of those are 65 watt limits. Should be doable here. So for small form factor stuff, that's going to be super interesting. And modest tower coolers as well. Something like an Arctic freezer would be able to deal with that. So looking at the 7700X though, and things aren't quite as impressive. I mean, you see a significant drop in power consumption if you drop from its default 105 watts to the 65 watts. So top of the graph, or near top of the graph. Where are we? Sorry, not top of the graph at all. About third of the way up. Ryzen 7 7700X, 20,030 points in Cinebench, and if we drop down to 65 watts, we are shaving about 800 points off that score. But if we go to the power consumption, we are dropping the power consumption from 273 watts to 203 watts. So a 70 watt power saving. And again, that is going to be coolable by some very modest cooling, and you'll be getting much lower temperatures as well. The 7950X was indeed very toasty under load as well. Now, I've heard some rumors that that might be something to do with the memory controller. If you drop the voltage on the memory controller, that might reduce things significantly, but I didn't have time to test that before getting the results up today. So that's going to be something that you might want to take a look at if you manage to bag yourself a Zen 4 CPU, especially the flagship. So what do we make of AMD's brand new Ryzen 7000 series CPUs then? Well, I've only had the chance to look at two of them. The other two are inbound from AMD, I believe. So what I'm waiting for is basically the Ryzen 5 7600X, the 6-core, and what I'm reliably told is the sweet spot, the Ryzen 9 7900X. Those two CPUs I'm still waiting for, but there are probably other people that have reviewed them out there already. But the Ryzen 9 7900X, like its predecessor, is shaping up to be quite a beast in terms of value for money, I think, as well. Because obviously the flagship, the 16-core, the 7950X is always going to demand a premium, but you do get absolutely exceptional performance with it, and it also has that stunning 65 watt eco mode where you can shave a huge amount of power off the power consumption, and thermals, knock to the floor as well. You can pretty much cool it with a low profile air cooler. but you still get performance that wipes the floor with the 12900K and the 5950X, which is super, super impressive. So I am very much looking forward to playing with the 7950X in some small form factor rigs and just seeing what that 65 watt mode can do. In terms of raw performance, it is way up there. So you're looking at pretty much the best gaming performance out there. Obviously the 12900K does match or better it on occasions. The 5800X3D, obviously an AMD CPU as well, does match or better it on occasions. But given that you're getting a stonking gaming CPU and an absolutely monstrous multi-threaded performing CPU, this is a fantastic new performance crown grabbing processor from AMD, and we don't know what Intel's got up its sleeves yet. We know that there's probably a Core i9 3900K with more than 16 cores out there. In fact, we pretty much know that it's a lot more than 16 cores. Who knows what that is going to offer in terms of single, lightly threaded and multi-threaded performance. We'll have to wait and see. If you want the fastest, most powerful CPU now, that is your boy. So the Ryzen 7700X, that's right, isn't it? Yeah, lots of sevens in there. Not so impressive, if I'm honest. It's still absolutely awesome in pretty much everything that it does, but it's more the price. The 12700K was just as fast, if not faster, in some benchmarks, not all, but some. But it costs less here in the UK, given the prices that I've been given by AMD recently. Now, pricing is something I'm reluctant to mention because everything is going to be, adjusting with a new launch. Intel's probably going to be dropping prices. AMD is going to be dropping prices of its previous stuff. It might be even dropping prices of these things, depending on how things shape up in the market. But the Intel 12th gen series are definitely not to be counted out. And of course, we've got 13th gen Raptor Lake just around the corner as well. So whichever of these two CPUs you're gunning for, it is worth remembering that Raptor Lake is just around the corner. However, Intel has a pretty steep mountain to climb in terms of bettering both of these CPUs, especially the 7950X, especially if you're considering running it in one of the low power modes, eco modes, which, as I mentioned, will be available as one-click options in your EFI and also in Ryzen Master soon, so you can have a play with those. But all in all, it's a fantastic launch for AMD. Probably the thing I'm most thankful for, as I mentioned earlier, is that the motherboards appear on the whole to be perfectly stable. I've had no problems at all with either of these CPUs in either one of these motherboards. So the ones I've been using are the ASRock X670E Steel Legend, the ASRock X670E Tai Chi, and the ASRock X670E, what is that thing called again? PG Lightning. There we go. More motherboards inbound, hopefully from MSI, Asus, and Gigabyte. I'm looking forward to looking at those soon. All I can say for now is that these boards that I've tested here have worked without a hitch. 6000 megahertz AMD Expo rated memory from G-Skill. The Trident Z Neo has run absolutely fine as well and does seem to offer performance improvements over bog standard 6000 megahertz DDR as well, thanks to those tweaked timings. So I would like to thank ASRock for sending in this trio of motherboards, and you can look forward to reviews of those over the next few days, and also for AMD for sending the samples. Also, thank you to Wonder, my water-cooled test bench here, for doing all the AMD testing, and Cosmo, basically because I couldn't fit him on the bench, he's just over the back there, he dealt with all the Intel testing. So thanks to Wonder, thanks to ASRock, thanks to AMD, and I will catch you soon. See ya.